So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Roger Finn.
Okay, thanks everyone. So I'm going to be talking now about customizing HTML output for the DITA-OT toolkit. I've been asked several times in the past how we manage to produce the output that we produce on the project website, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that. It's not rocket science, but there are a few things to know, so I'll try to share that with you now. So there's this motion within the web development community to use standard frameworks. And as Jarno sort of alluded to earlier today, there is a new JavaScript framework every week. And all of the cool kids switch their tools every few weeks or so. So that's kind of a cancer in a way in the web development community, but that also means that there's a lot of innovation going on. So web output is getting better day by day. And one framework builds on another, and things just keep improving in some way. And some of the accessibility things that Robert has been working on for our output, some of the frameworks do a good job with that and things like that. So sometimes the easiest way to get good output is to piggyback onto something that already exists rather than recreating it. So these notions of, initially they were just CSS frameworks. So years ago there was something called 960GS, which was like a 960 pixel wide grid system. It was at the time viewed as a very innovative way of styling page layout on a grid, like old typographers would do in books. And having that grid adapt somewhat to the size of the viewport or the user's browser window. But that was kind of before mobile happened. That was just an idea that was sort of helped make things a little bit more predictable for Internet Explorer versus Firefox and all of those sorts of things. So the web evolved beyond that. And a bunch of other frameworks came around as well. And one of them is called HTML5 boilerplate. There are a bunch of things like Twitter Bootstrap or Zerb Foundation, two of the largest frameworks that are most popular, that have evolved to really build pretty robust sites. However, they're not just based on CSS anymore. Most of these frameworks have an awful lot of JavaScript under the hood and things like that. So many web developers consider them to be too heavyweight. In order to plug your stuff into these frameworks, you're getting a lot of stuff that you don't need. And if you are developing in an environment where you need a lean output that is quickly loaded and doesn't contain a lot of unnecessary code, that might not be the best way to go. So this is one option that I'll describe today, but it's not the best option. It's certainly not suitable for every situation. You may want to look at other solutions, but I will describe today what we do with the project website, which uses Bootstrap, but I'll talk about it in a way that hopefully applies to other frameworks as well. So the code samples that I will give are specific to our site and to Bootstrap, but the basic notion of how to go about doing this will be applicable to other frameworks. So that's the idea. With these custom plugins that we can create for the toolkit, we can take the HTML5 output that the toolkit generates and use these frameworks or these templates so that our generated documents can build on these existing front-end solutions. So we'll talk today about the DITA-OT website itself, just look briefly at that and how that is built, why that might be useful to you, and actually to sort of underscore my argument for the rest of the talk, why it might not. And then we'll talk about, if that's not suitable for you, what could you do to do something similar for your own output. So we'll look then at some specific code examples about how to add CSS metadata to the output, how to maybe add a navigation menu and some classes to your body output that will allow you to hook into the built-in styles that the frameworks provide. And then we'll just show a brief example of styling navigation. So just a quick overview of the types of things you can do. And then toward the end, we'll sort of look at, is there an easier way to do this? So how do we build the project website? Those of you that have been to DITA-OT Day in the past have heard me talk about these things before, so I'll just provide a quick summary now. But since our source code for the toolkit and for the documentation is hosted on GitHub, we make use of a service that GitHub provides for code that's hosted there, and that service is called GitHub Pages. GitHub Pages is one of a series of tools called static site generators that take basic plain text information and turn that into something else for publishing on the web. So we use GitHub Pages just because it's sort of built into the service that we use otherwise. There are other services that we could use just as well, but that one's convenient for us. So the website is, the sort of the code, the underlying source code for the website is quite a hybrid. So the documentation content that we deliver there is, of course, maintained in DITA and DITA XML and published via the DITA Open Toolkit and all of that. But around those documentation pages are some other pages on the website. So a landing page with pretty bullet points and a couple of graphics. There's a menu with some information on other things, how to contribute to the project, and all of these things that are not included in the docs. So we don't maintain that content in DITA. Such heresy, I know. But those simple web pages we maintain just in Markdown. Or in HTML, where Markdown does not suffice because sometimes we need to add some classes and things in there. So basically, this whole project website is quite a hybrid, but we really kind of strongly believe on the idea of using the right tool for the job. So if a page is so simple that it's just a heading and some text, it's in Markdown. Why bother putting angle brackets in there with HTML and CSS classes? Why bother using XML for that? All we need is a heading and some text. And that's the beauty of a static site generator, is that you can do that. So we don't need to take that Markdown and convert it to HTML before it's displayed. The underlying technology behind GitHub Pages is something called Jekyll. And Jekyll is, as the name suggests, something that is by day one thing and by night another. So your Markdown lives a plain, unassuming existence until it lands on the server and someone tries to access it, and then it's turned into hideous HTML with angle brackets and pointy things that are sharp and dangerous. But essentially, Jekyll is really something like the DITA Open Toolkit, we can say. I mean, at a conference like this, where we're talking about a document converter that takes something in one format and outputs another, Jekyll is one of our peers, in a way. It's used by other people for different things, and of course, it's not nearly as fantastic as our project, right? I wouldn't ever insinuate something like that, but they are peers in a way. And there are big brothers and small sisters and whatever. Anyway. Bad metaphors. So in order to do this, we have a custom plugin for the DITA Open Toolkit. So to produce our documentation, we could generate plain HTML5 output from the toolkit, but as we all know, that wouldn't be pretty because it was never intended to be pretty. It was intended to serve as the basis of customization because we can't know what your definition of pretty is. Our definition of pretty is the site plugin, or our definition of pretty 4 years ago? I don't know, maybe. So at some point in time, this plugin was developed to create the output for the website. So the source code for this plugin is available on GitHub. There's the link. And before all of those Slack clients and notification buzzers go off because 10 people have forked the DITA-OT or DITA-OT HTML repository, which happens occasionally. People fork this and say, cool, I'm gonna get a great, cool website like that. And then when you look at the sort of network graph that GitHub offers, after the fork, nothing happened. Right? So people thought this would be an easy way to get some quick output that looks pretty. So why don't you just use this? Well, there's a couple of reasons. And I think that these couple of reasons are the reasons why usually after that initial fork, I don't see commits and I don't see other websites out there published based on this. And that's because it contains a good bit of code that is specific to our project, right? So we're generating output for our project, for our website. We put stuff in there that's for us. You could fork this and take all of our stuff out and put your stuff in, true. But you have to figure out what's ours and what's not. So that's kind of tricky, and I haven't seen so many people doing that. That said, perhaps there are lots of people that are doing that and have just kept the result behind their corporate firewall, as is a valid thing to do with open source, borrow from others and hide it afterward, right? So that's entirely possible. We don't know. But another reason is that this requires Jekyll. So this static site generator that I mentioned that is built into GitHub Pages is built into this plugin as well. So the output that we generate assumes that it will not be going onto a web server as a standard web server, but actually will be going into a system that is powered by Jekyll, that is then converted into other things. So if you look at the HTML that we produce from this plugin, it's not even valid HTML, because there's things up at the top of the page that aren't even HTML. There's like a YAML header block there it's weird stuff if you don't know what it is, and you think, oh my god, why does this look silly in my browser? Well, because your browser doesn't have the rendering capacity to turn that stuff at the top into proper HTML. So this is all basically snippets of things, and the site plugin basically constructs the snippets that are later assembled into a proper page. So there's another snippet somewhere that defines the page header. The snippets that we generate go into that box, and there's another snippet elsewhere that generates the footer and stuff like this. So it's basically, all you get is puzzle pieces if you use this. And you need to have the other pieces for the puzzle. Now, of course, savvy open sourcers among you would also know enough to clone another repository that has the puzzle pieces and then stick them all together. Yes, can be done, but you would be looking at lots of puzzle pieces and deciding which ones to discard. And another thing about this that makes it perhaps not the very best starting point is that this site plugin was created several years ago based on the version of the HTML5 code that existed then. So the HTML5 plugin that this was branched off of has evolved since. And it still works. It still works for our purposes. It still works so well that we haven't bothered to port it to the new version of the HTML5 plugin. I imagine on days when we have lots of time, that might be a good thing to do, right? As an illustrative example of how to port an old customization to a new version of a plugin. Could be a conference talk. So if anyone's looking for an idea for a talk, there you go. But let's just start from scratch. Since OT 3.0 just came out, we have a new version of all sorts of plugins and things, and with each version we refine a few things. And the HTML5 version HTML5 plugin has received some attention as well, particularly with regard to the accessibility and things like that that Robert has been working on. So if you'd like to take advantage of all of those recent developments, it might be best to do that. So I won't try to make a DITA Open Toolkit plugin customization workshop out of this. Just got like 3 more slides, and then we'll sort of stop at that. But the basic idea is that we build on the foundation that the HTML5 plugin provides, look at the pieces of the code that we would like to change, and insert something in there. So we're basically, with what we're doing here, not taking anything away, but just the code that the toolkit produces by itself, we insert a few things in there, above, below, and in between. And that's what the next slides are about, how to insert things and in which places to insert them. And as I said, the examples that I'll show here will be based on Bootstrap, but that same approach would be necessary if you are working in a company where, let's say, your entire web development team, your front-end developers, all use Zerb Foundation or something like that. Then you would do that same thing, you would just insert different lines of code there. But the same approach is basically necessary. So one way to get started here is that we would, wait a minute, that didn't work exactly as I intended it to. Hang on a sec. Let's see here. Okay, it does want to do it that way. So that is a snippet of code that has been dimmed because that's all the default stuff. So we basically go into the DITA HTML5 plugin that is shipped with the toolkit. I know that's too small to read. Sorry, I'll explain what's there in a minute. You don't really actually need to see the letters. But You go into that HTML5 plugin that the toolkit provides, and look for the style sheet that contains the chapter head template mode. Because what we want to do now is at the top of each HTML page, in the header, we want to insert a line that gives us our CSS for the Bootstrap framework. So that's the one place that something goes in there, is a line of CSS. And Bootstrap works best when it has a couple of metadata elements added as well. So just some of this is not so specific to Bootstrap, but rather like basic responsive web design kind of thing. So there's a meta element here that says it's XUA compatible content, i.e. Edge. For those of you that know how that triggers certain browser parsing modes, that's important so that some of the browsers know how to handle this. If anyone else wants to speak more eloquently about what that particular line of text is about, I'm open to hecklers. Apart from that, there's another line that says viewport, and that viewport line says that your content should have a width that is equal to the device width. So basically what you're showing is as wide as the viewport, or as the user's browser window is. And the initial scale is 1, meaning that we can scale that then up and down. So as the browser window increases and whatever, users may actually use the plus or the minus because they would like to increase the text size or something like this. So the presence of these elements help the browsers to properly understand that. And if I'm talking nonsense, I'm sure someone would tell me. So that's it. We basically take a couple of lines of code and insert them in there to make sure that our CSS framework that depends on them can rely on them being there. So yeah, there's our CSS line again. Next thing we do is we want to, in the middle of the chapter body template, add a few different things. So the way these plugins are structured is there's some style sheets, and the style sheets each have little XSL templates that say, these are the things that you should do with this part of the content. And here we're in the chapter body, so this is basically the code that determines the content of the page. So the content of your DITA topic is going to be rendered into this box. And in this box, we insert some things. So here, for instance, we say that we would like to have a menu. So in Bootstrap, there is a class called navbar header. So that's the broad, in our case, blue bar at the top of the site that says DITA-OT and documentation and contribute and things like that. So a couple of static menu items that we have there that we want to appear on every page. There's nothing dynamic about them. There are 4 or 5 links. We hard code them, and they get injected into our generated output in this fashion. A few other things happen here. This defines the class of the navbar, so it basically says this navbar is one that is static, meaning it sticks to the top of the page, and if you scroll your page down, the menu bar will go away and the menu will disappear. Some people prefer for the menu to remain visible. Sorry, Jarno, you want to say something? 5. Oh, yeah, thank you. No worries. That means that the menu will always stay at the top. So the static navbar basically scrolls with the page. There's another one that can kind of float and stick to the top so that your page content can scroll by and the menu will remain visible. So if you prefer that approach, you would change navbar static top to a different class, which I think is something amazingly semantic, like dynamic or something like that. I don't know, I'd have to check the Bootstrap code, but and we assign a role to that, so the accessibility tools know that this thing is not just a container, but actually a container that has a particular role to serve as navigation on the site. And then we just put a box around the middle of the page. So this div with the class container basically also just tells Bootstrap, use your container classes for this. So Bootstrap has a whole bunch of built-in stuff that work well when boxes have this container label associated with them. So that's some of the simple things that we're doing there. Navbar header is there. And then one thing that we also style is the navigation. So this is something that was added at some point to the HTML5 code, the ability to add in-page navigation. This allowed us to get rid of that old talk.js frame set and things like that. So we can render a navigation for our DITA publication into each page, either as the full table of contents for the entire publication, or the way we choose to do it here in the project website as a partial navigation that shows some of the siblings for the current topic. So we don't try to show everything all the time, but some things that are nearby to allow users to navigate. So that needs to be rendered in a certain place, and in order to do that, we add a navigation element that has a couple of classes. So in our case, the site is based on a grid of a certain number of columns. I believe it is a 12-column layout. We have determined that we want our navigation column to be 3 columns wide. So we take 3 of our 12 units and allocate them to the navigation, assign that a role of talk so that the accessibility tools know that this is our table of contents. We give that box a certain style, so we give it a gray background, inset with a little bit of shadow. That comes from the class called well, so a well sort of inset element on the page. That's just something that Bootstrap brings along. So we don't have to decide what would we like our table of contents to look. We basically go to the CSS reference from Bootstrap and say, what sort of cool things do they have? They have some nice looking boxes. I like the way that box looks. I'll add that class for well and well small to our output, and then we're done. We get a pretty box without having to think much about how to do it. And then the unordered list that actually stores the list items with our navigation elements, that also gets a class that says, in this case, BS docs side nav, so Bootstrap documentation navigation. Guess what? The Bootstrap documentation also has a sidebar with navigation in it. I didn't want to reinvent the wheel, neither did Jarno. Nobody bothered to do something better than the Bootstrap people did. They've done a good job. So we just, basically by stealing a few classes from there, we're able to make our navigation look fairly pretty. And the good thing about it is that they've put a lot of effort into this. These people know what they're doing. So just, stealing their code was a very quick way of getting something that works well. And that's a very sort of established pattern. So that's it. That's kind of the basic way to go about it. In a perfect world, I would have packaged all of this up into a properly functioning DITA Open Toolkit plugin, and the last slide would have been a URL to that where you could download it yourself and install it and use it without having to understand how it works. I must say that I spent more time last week finishing the documentation for the 3.0 release of DITA Open Toolkit because I thought that would help more users than are in this room. So I apologize for not packaging up that plugin entirely over the last few days, but I had to make some choices with regard to priorities. I still think that's a good idea. And once I've slept and recovered from this conference and not talked to anybody for a while, and just I'll probably do that at some point. So if that's something that you're interested in, keep in touch. If I manage to do that, I will probably talk about it publicly and let you know that it's out there. So if anyone is interested in, at some point, a Bootstrap plugin for the toolkit, I think we'll have one of those one day. Any questions? Wow, that was loud.
It was too clear, right?
Okay.
Well, why haven't you already done this for?
You have a question?
Yes, I do. The man in the back with the knit cap.
Okay, thank you. So I sort of have a question. What you're describing here, using Bootstrap and all, that's what the so-called front-end developers usually do.
Right.
Most people here some people here might create plugins for toolkits,
Right.
but might not identify as front-end developers, and they might say, you have people doing the front-end development in a different department.
That's right.
So also as a question for people who've done these sort of things, where does the line go? When do you deliver the stuff to the front-end development team and say, my job's done, you carry on? Or is it that you create a plugin that generates a complete deliverable from the website? Or what website?
I think that I met someone that worked on a small team like me,
and there's no front-end developers. We're writers, and with data adoption, you'll see much more smaller teams working with data. So we don't have 500 writers and developers and front-end developers. So I do appreciate.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Jarno, and that kind of points to a slight sort of didactic gap in the slides, because there's an application point there that I didn't make, and that is, this is the answer to the question that you get from the web team in your company when they come to you and say, your HTML output doesn't look nice. Where do I put the stuff that makes it look nice? They're not experienced with DITA Open Toolkit. They make pretty websites. But you give them this HTML that comes out, and they're like, yeah, but you overwrite all the pretty stuff that I put in there last week. Well, yes, we regenerate it every time we change a comma. Well, where do I put the stuff in so that when you regenerate it, when you change a comma, it looks like our corporate website? This is the answer to that question. So there are certain places where that stuff goes, and the way that that workflow would usually work is you would sit down with your web development team, you would ask them, what is it that you need, and either you then put in the stuff that they say, or you give them these templates and say, these are the parts you have to change. So if you want 3 lines of CSS in there, or certain HTML classes associated with these elements, this is the place that you have to put them. So it's basically just about educating people who produce DITA stuff just enough to let them know where are the screws that the people can turn that need to make things look different. You may not need to do this yourself because there may be a whole team for that in your company, but you need to be able to tell them where to do it and how to change things. So that's it. Yeah. Okay. More questions?
To which extent should you train your writers to understand the framework? Because Bootstrap is based on classes.
Right.
I use it in my documentation.
Right.
And I let my authors write classes from Bootstrap in
Right.
DITA code.
Yeah.
Sometimes they have to control a little bit more what is going to happen.
Yeah.
And also because Bootstrap is based on a 12 column
Mm-hmm.
template.
Yep.
Sometimes you run into problems when you want to do dynamic.
That's right.
Because you have to control the environment. So what I've done is put stuff in the subject key to control the output class.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still a bit, I have a problem drawing the line between what's done automatically with the XSLT,
Right.
what the writer has the right to do.
Yeah, I think that's a basic, I'm not sure, could everyone hear Lionel's question? With regard to just how much freedom to give your writers with these things? I think that goes back to a question that we discuss at these conferences all the time, is how rigid should we be in what we offer people, and how flexible should we be? So this is a very powerful system, and you can do all sorts of things with the output class attribute in your DITA code. So you can slap anything you want into an output class on something, and if you have a framework like Bootstrap that does something with that output class, your authors can make their list items pink and purple and yellow and green. But the question is, do you want them to do that? Or do you live in an environment where making a list item pink is grounds for dismissal? I don't know, right? But it's a very powerful tool. Use it responsibly. We've had talks at these conferences in the past where people said, you don't need any of this stuff. Just put an output class on absolutely everything and you can do whatever you want. The spec allows it. Some people don't think that's a good idea. So I think that really, the classic answer is it depends, right? Elliot, you had your hand up for a while, but I don't see it now.
Well, I was just going to say, I've done some HTML stuff for larger companies, and in that case, yes, we're producing the HTML that then feeds into their larger corporate-defined web environment.
Right.
That's always good.
Yep, I think that's the answer. Is that you can feed into their corporate web environment. You just need to know what their, which things they require, and then if you know where to stick them in our DITA code, then we can make that happen. So, okay, enough. Thank you.
Thank you.